Fixing California's housing crisis. Today, a bipartisan group of state lawmakers unveiled a series of bills aimed to try to do that. The bills specifically aiming to make it easier and quicker to build all across the state. But will it actually make a difference here in the Bay Area?
California's housing costs are now more than double the national average. While construction of single-family homes has slowed sharply, the debate is no longer about whether housing is expensive. It is about why and what that means long-term. Real estate attorney Michael Capaldi has spent decades navigating California's land use system. His focus is clear: why building a single-family home in the state costs so much, and how policy decisions over the past 40 to 50 years have reshaped the housing market. The numbers are hard to ignore. 54% of California voters aged 18 to 39 say they have considered leaving because of housing costs. Meanwhile, the median home price ranges between $800,000 and $900,000.
In almost every single household in California. And lack of housing affordability affects every other aspect of our society.
Compared to roughly $400,000 nationally. Even inland counties with available land remain expensive. The constraint is not just geography, it is structural. State leaders routinely acknowledge affordability concerns, yet decades of accumulated regulation remain largely intact. Laws such as the California Environmental Quality Act require environmental review for most developments, often leading to extended studies, revisions, and potential legal challenges. In development, time equals money, and delays increase carrying costs, financing expenses, and overall project risk. Beyond CEQA, planning bodies such as local agency formation commissions influence where growth can occur, often limiting outward expansion in favor of denser urban development.
Fundamentally rethink how and where we live as a state, and permitting reform really gets at exactly that.
Critics argue this reduces the supply of traditional single-family housing, even in areas where land itself is not scarce. The outcome is measurable. California issues fewer housing permits per capita than states like Texas or Florida, while construction costs run an estimated 20% to 30% above the national average. Over time, zoning limits, environmental review, and layered approval processes have narrowed the path to home ownership for middle-income households. This is not just a debate about urban versus rural land. It is about policy design and how it shapes supply. When fewer homes are built than demand requires, prices rise. When approval timelines stretch, financing costs climb. And when uncertainty grows, smaller builders exit the market, leaving only large firms able to navigate the system.
Why are ADUs popping up everywhere in California? It's not just a trend, it's a clue. Homeowners are building backyard homes, converting garages, and stacking units because the traditional housing supply just isn't cutting it.
California's housing challenge developed over decades, shaped by legislation, court decisions, and local governance structures. Today, the effects are visible in affordability gaps, migration patterns, and long-term economic competitiveness. Housing costs are not purely a market outcome. They are closely tied to the regulatory framework that determines what gets built, where, and how quickly. Across the state, 58 local agency formation commissions oversee growth boundaries, often limiting outward expansion in favor of denser urban development. Over the past decade, state legislation has increasingly prioritized infill projects, transit-oriented housing, and multifamily construction. The policy direction is intentional, but the outcomes remain debated. The Newhall Ranch project in Los Angeles County illustrates the complexity. The proposal included about 20,000 homes, commercial space, and preserved open land. Yet from initial permits to final approvals, the process lasted roughly 24 years. That timeline spans multiple economic cycles. The law for developers holding land for decades introduces major financial risk. Ongoing legal, consulting, and financing costs with no guarantee of completion. When approval timelines become unpredictable, capital looks elsewhere. Some developers shift investment to states with clearer entitlement processes. And when capital leaves a high-demand market, supply tighten, pushing prices higher. Construction costs add another layer. A RAND Corporation study estimates that comparable housing construction in California costs about 2.3 times more than in Texas and roughly 1.5 times more than in Colorado. The gap reflects more than materials, it reflects regulatory structure. And put it in simple terms, a 2,000 square foot home that costs about $300,000 to build in Texas can cost $600,000 to $700,000 in California. And that is before land, financing, permits, or compliance fees. Once those layers are added, total development costs rise dramatically. Material prices are national. Labor markets are competitive everywhere. What separates California is the structure around construction: longer permitting timelines, environmental reviews, impact fees, and added compliance standards. In some cities, development impact fees alone range from $50,000 to over $100,000 per unit. When approvals stretch for years, financing costs compound quickly. The issue is not just construction expense, it is regulatory complexity interacting with financial risk. When timelines become unpredictable and cost multipliers exceed national norms, fewer firms are willing to move forward. The pipeline narrows, supply tightens, prices respond. Even compared to Colorado, construction costs in California can run roughly 40% higher, often $500,000 per unit versus about $320,000 elsewhere. That gap reflects decades of layered policy decisions. One policy frequently cited by developers is vehicle miles traveled, or VMT. Instead of focusing only on traffic congestion, regulators estimate how many miles future residents are likely to drive. For a large project, say 4,000 homes, planners calculate projected annual driving patterns. If those projections exceed state targets, developers may be required to redesign the project, reduce unit counts, or add mitigation measures. California's climate framework calls for reducing vehicle miles traveled per capita by about 15% by 2050. That benchmark now influences housing approvals. The metric focuses on total miles driven regardless of vehicle type. In practice, projects in outer suburban or inland regions, such as Riverside County, San Bernardino County, or parts of the Central Valleys or Sister Freud, often face stricter scrutiny because projected commute distances are longer. Mitigation requirements can include transit investments, infrastructure contributions, or transportation demand programs. San Diego County has estimated that VMT-related compliance can add at least $50,000 per unit in some cases, with higher figures depending on scale and location. VMT is not a flat fee. It functions as a regulatory threshold. If projected driving exceeds state limits, projects may require redesigns, added mitigation measures, or extended review. Each adjustment increases consultant costs, financing expenses, and timelines. For developers targeting inland areas where land is cheaper and construction costs can be lower, VMT can reshape the financial equation. A project that looks viable on paper may become far more expensive once transportation modeling and emissions compliance are factored in. Supporters argue the framework aligns housing growth with climate goals and encourages development near transit. Critics argue it limits supply in lower-cost regions, intensifying pressure in already expensive markets. What is measurable is this: environmental and transportation regulations now directly influence where housing is built and how much it costs. The geographic impact is clear. Projects near major job centers, Los Angeles, Long Beach, San Francisco, the Bay Area core, are easier to justify under VMT standards. Projects farther from employment hubs face stricter evaluation. The policy direction favors dense urban corridors, and that shift affects housing choice. Instead of expanding suburban single-family inventory in lower-cost inland regions, growth increasingly moves toward multifamily buildings in city centers. For many households, that means renting in higher-density neighborhoods rather than pursuing ownership in outlying communities. The affordability pressure shows up in the numbers. California's homeownership rate sits near 55% compared to about 66% nationally. Among younger adults, ownership rates are lower still. Meanwhile, The median age of first-time homebuyers nationwide has climbed into the mid-30s, the highest on record. Cost structure adds another layer. Moving from a 2-story wood frame building to 4 stories can raise construction costs by roughly 20% to 30% due to stricter codes, fire systems, and structural requirements. Stepping into mid-rise and high-rise construction often requires steel and reinforced concrete framing, pushing costs 40% to 50% higher compared to low-rise wood construction. Urban infill brings its own cost pressures: structured parking, land assembly, demolition, utility relocation, and extended permitting timelines. In Los Angeles, total development costs for mid-rise multifamily projects often exceed $600,000 per unit once land, construction, fees, and financing are included. By contrast, lower density suburban projects, where land is cheaper and wood frame construction dominates, typically carry lower per unit costs even after infrastructure upgrades. Environmental impact also varies by building type. High-rise construction depends heavily on steel and concrete materials associated with higher embodied carbon during production. Wood frame single-family construction follows a different emissions profile. The environmental comparison depends on density, commuting patterns, and energy standards. It is not one-dimensional. The debate then is not density versus suburbs, it is trade-offs. Urban towers increase proximity to jobs and transit. Suburban homes often reduce construction cost per unit and expand ownership options. Policy determines which model moves forward, and policy shapes price. When high-density development becomes the primary path for new supply, total project costs often rise. Financing becomes more complex. Final sale prices and rents reflect that structure. The tension is visible in production data. Over the past 7 years, California has built roughly 70,000 to 80,000 units annually. State housing assessments estimate the need is closer to 180,000 units per year to stabilize affordability. At the current pace, the deficit compounds annually. Environmental targets remain ambitious. Housing demand remains strong. The imbalance sits between the two. Development fees compound the pressure. Originally intended to fund infrastructure tied directly to growth, impact fees in many California cities now range from $30,000 to over $100,000 per unit. Research from Housing Policy Institute suggests regulatory costs and fees can represent 20% to 30% of the final home price in certain markets. Development fees have increasingly become part of broader municipal revenue planning. While they still fund infrastructure, a portion supports general local expenses. Economically, those costs are capitalized into housing prices. Builders model them into project budgets, lenders underwrite them, buyers and renters ultimately pay for them. The impact is measurable. California's median home price remains more than twice the national average. Timelines are longer, approval processes are more layered, financing risk is higher. Statewide development and permit fees average roughly $29,000 to $30,000 per unit, often climbing much higher in major job centers. Compare that nationally. In Texas, similar fees can average around $1,000 per unit. In Colorado, closer to $12,000. The difference is significant. In certain California cities, the numbers rise sharply. In Fremont, reported city-related fees on one project approached $160,000 per unit. With home prices exceeding $800,000, fees alone represented nearly 20% of total cost. In high-demand corridors like Silicon Valley and coastal Southern California, fee structures can determine whether a project is financially viable at all. When projected returns cannot justify these costs, projects simply do not move forward. That helps explain why production levels remain below state housing targets. Lawmakers have attempted targeted reforms, including adjustments to CEQA to streamline qualifying infill projects on underused commercial sites. In some cases, approvals have accelerated, but environmental review is only one layer. Zoning remains a central hurdle. Converting commercial land to residential use often requires rezoning, public hearings, planning votes, and infrastructure upgrades. Each step adds time and cost. Financial feasibility is equally critical. Urban infill frequently requires structured parking, demolition, environmental remediation, and more complex construction methods. Even with streamlined approvals, total costs can exceed what rents or sale prices can realistically support. The pattern is consistent. Fees, zoning, compliance, infrastructure, and financing risk operate as stacked constraints. Adjusting one layer helps, but when the cumulative burden crosses a threshold, projects stall, and supply remains tight. Recent changes to environmental review rules have streamlined approvals for some housing projects, but only when land is already zoned residential. Many aging shopping centers and commercial sites are not. That means developers must first secure rezoning approval, and that is where complexity returns. California's governance structure adds another layer. The state has 58 counties and 483 incorporated cities, each with its own planning department, zoning code, and approval authority. Even when projects align with state housing targets, local governments retain broad discretion over whether they proceed. That fragmentation shapes outcomes. A proposal may meet technical requirements yet still face delays, redesigns, or rejection after public hearings. Organized neighborhood groups frequently raise concerns about traffic, density, infrastructure strain, or property values. In many cases, a single city council vote determines whether a project advances or stalls. Even compliant projects often face additional reviews, conditional use permits, design boards, environmental studies, each adding time and cost. Developers describe the process as layered and unpredictable. Delays increase carrying costs, consultant fees, and financing risk. The result is a system with multiple gatekeepers. Environmental compliance raises requirements. Development fees increase per unit costs. Zoning limits eligible land. Local politics determines final approval. When these factors overlap, projects can linger for years. California's housing shortfall is not driven by one barrier alone. It reflects the interaction between regulatory cost structures and localized decision-making power. State policy may encourage production, but final outcomes often rest at the city level. Then comes the land question. Only about 6% of California's land area is developed, meaning roughly 94% remains undeveloped, including agricultural land, deserts, mountains, forests, and federally owned property. Not all of it is buildable, but statewide land scarcity is not absolute. Large areas of the Central Valley, inland Southern California, and desert regions remain lightly developed. The limiting factor is less about total land availability and more about zoning, infrastructure, environmental standards, and approval processes. The deeper constraint is policy alignment, where growth is allowed, how it is approved, and what it ultimately costs. The economic impact is measurable. Roughly 54% of California voters aged 18 to 39 say they have considered leaving the state because of housing costs. That group represents a large share of the future workforce and entrepreneurial base. Recent years have shown consistent net domestic migration losses, with affordability frequently cited as a major factor. Home ownership plays a central role in long-term financial stability. Nationally, median homeowner net worth ranges between $250,000 and $300,000, while renter median net worth often falls below $10,000. Federal Reserve data shows homeowners' net worth can be more than 40 times higher than renters, largely due to accumulated equity. Ownership builds assets, mortgage payments convert into equity, property appreciation compounds over time. For many households, home equity is their largest financial resource, a source of refinancing power, business capital, or long-term security. When entry-level ownership becomes harder to access, wealth building slows. Younger households delay buying, relocate to lower-cost states, or remain renters longer. That shift influences labor mobility, entrepreneurship, and local investment patterns. The demographic signals are already visible. California's population growth has slowed significantly. The state has experienced sustained domestic outmigration, and the median age continues to rise. An aging population changes workforce dynamics and long-term fiscal planning. Meanwhile, a generational divide emerges. Households that purchased homes decades ago hold substantial equity gains. New entrants face median home prices near $800,000 to $900,000 in many regions. As ownership rates decline among younger residents, wealth accumulation becomes increasingly uneven. Economists describe housing as both shelter and a financial instrument. In appreciating markets, ownership becomes a long-term store of value. Without access to ownership, households rely primarily on wages and savings, which typically grow far more slowly than leveraged real estate equity. In California, the issue goes beyond individual wealth. Housing access affects labor mobility, entrepreneurship, retirement planning, and long-term economic resilience. When ownership becomes concentrated among earlier buyers, while new households struggle to enter the market, the broader economic structure begins to shift. A strong middle class has historically anchored economic stability. Households that buy homes, invest locally, and plan to stay tend to support long-term community growth. Rising housing costs have raised concerns about whether that foundation is narrowing. The cost structure creates a visible divide. High-income earners in technology, entertainment, and finance can often absorb median prices nearing $800,000 to $900,000 in many regions. Lower-income residents may remain due to job ties or limited mobility. The pressure point sits squarely in the middle. Households earning too much for assistance but not enough to comfortably enter the market. Migration patterns reflect this strain. California has experienced sustained net domestic outmigration in recent years, with affordability frequently cited as a driving factor. When working-age residents leave, workforce composition shifts and local tax bases evolve. Historically, California expanded differently. In the post-World War II decades, infrastructure, job growth, and housing development moved together. Aerospace, entertainment, and manufacturing provided stable middle-income employment. Home ownership expanded broadly. The state's population grew from about 10 million in 1950 to nearly 40 million today, fueled largely by domestic migration. Today, high-value job sectors remain strong, but housing production has not kept pace with employment growth in many metro areas. When supply trails demand, prices escalate, and middle-income households feel the pressure most acutely. California's GDP exceeds $3 trillion, making it one of the largest economies in the world. The economic engine is powerful. The structural question is whether housing supply, infrastructure, and opportunity can realign to keep ownership accessible across income levels. California's future will depend on how housing policy, local governance, and infrastructure planning evolve. The stakes go far beyond real estate. They affect workforce sustainability, wealth distribution, and long-term economic competitiveness. The contrast across the state is striking. California leads globally in technology, venture capital, and innovation, with a GDP exceeding $3 trillion. Yet aging roads, strained power grids, and ongoing water and land management challenges highlight infrastructure gaps. The disconnect between economic strength and structural capacity has become central to public debate. Housing sits at the core of that tension. As affordability pressures intensify, working-age residents have increasingly relocated to states like Texas, Arizona, Tennessee, and Idaho, where median home prices are often half those of California's coastal metros. U.S. Census data shows sustained net domestic outmigration in recent years, particularly among middle-income households. When residents leave, the effects ripple outward. Labor markets adjust, demographics shift, community stability changes. For many households, the question is not whether opportunity exists. It clearly does, but whether long-term stability feels achievable. Policy reform proposals vary. Some analysts argue that elements of the vehicle miles traveled framework, shaped through legislation and administrative action, could be revised through future executive or legislative changes. Others focus on reforming the California Environmental Quality Act enacted in 1970, suggesting clearer timelines and more defined legal standards to reduce uncertainty while preserving environmental review. The broader debate centers on balance, maintaining environmental standards while lowering unpredictability and cost escalation. State housing plans call for approximately 2.5 to 3.5 million new homes by the end of the decade to address accumulated shortages, a scale that would require production levels far above recent averages. California remains one of the most influential regional economies in the world. The challenge ahead is structural, aligning regulation, local authority, infrastructure capacity, and housing supply in a way that expands access to ownership and restores long-term stability.